I'm going to talk to you about Brookfield Place and obviously mainly focus on the heritage buildings that were part of sort of a 7 to 8 year journey that we went on with a range of different people, and just let you know on what it was that drove our thinking and has shaped the end result that we've got there today. And the reason I've got these funny little pictures up on the right hand side are they're the sorts of spaces that people like to be in and we need to protect, and I'm absolutely convinced that we can actually slide quite significant scale new buildings into our existing cities and look after the things that people love about them and actually enhance the things that people love about their existing cities. So I'm going to touch on the context of this project. This is a photo that most of you would know from along St George's Terrace. This was it still is, the largest intact series of buildings on a main street in Perth. Everyone knows that most of this was torn down in sort of the development frenzy in the 60s and early 70s. And the fact that these buildings remain is almost a fluke. So this was the site once we started working it through. We've got a very significant high-rise building, which I'm sure most of you have seen on the skyline. It's got a large, extensive lobby and a core, which is all the lifts servicing the building and the mechanical and engineering strategy that moves up the outside of the building, and it's got a large cafe court on the southern side. But the reality was that it had to be inserted with a series of pieces that would actually activate and enliven the space, and then in a real way engage all of these heritage buildings. These were a gift because it meant that we weren't starting from nothing. It's quite difficult to design a ground plane with a tall corporate building and just invent all of this stuff around it and turn it into a place that feels good. The scale of the city when we move from north to south actually changes, and we have these like smaller, tighter grain spaces on the north, which is where people like to spend their slow time. So if you're having a cup of coffee or a beer, you tend to enjoy being in those sorts of spaces. And as we drop south, we get to the corporate side, which is what I call sort of a suit-wearing, more constrained, and for a long time it was a pretty boring place to be in our city. So we've got the major grid that runs over the city that's been set up since our city was founded, but we've got all these fantastic tight little laneways that the city's rediscovering and turning back into great places to be. So what we wanted to do, and this was the work we started doing with the Heritage Council and with the City of Perth, was straight away say, we want to treat this whole district as a precinct and turn it into something that as soon as you arrive, you recognise that you've come to a place in the city and a permeable precinct. So we're not trying to build a wall around it. This is quite a different way to approach a commercial building. Instead of having a grand modernist plaza, we want to create a series of smaller, intimate connections that move through to the tower, but celebrate the smaller buildings and the finer grain as we get there. We spent a lot of time with the clients making them understand that a smaller space is actually better than a larger space. So we're quite happy to have some of these squares, which are sort of meeting spaces, but the connections that move through, we spent a lot of time actually crushing them and making them smaller. So what we actually did was say, this is the scale of the heritage buildings, that is a human-scaled experience, and we don't want to overwhelm this by smacking this massive big thing straight down the back of it. So what we did, and fortunately the brief that we had for the main tenant, was we were able to put a piece on the podium level of the tower that had a direct relationship with the heritage buildings, and it meant that your experience when you move between these is one of a street and lane scaled experience before you hit the tower. This is the lobby for the tower. It's an enabled or an activated lobby, so most of the time I would describe it as wearing a suit and a tie, but it has the ability to be transformed and particular events are on by hanging rigging bars there, plugging in data and plugging in power. So you can do something like this in the lobby. The Festival of Perth and the Fringe Festival or whoever it might be are able to engage in there properly. And Brookfield, I give them a lot of credit for actually having a strategy around engaging this space so that when you arrive here, you move through the heritage buildings, you may have a meal in one of the heritage buildings, you may interact with them, but you may have an experience there that you weren't expecting, which is quite important in cities. We're really interested in the spaces between buildings and turning them into spaces where people want to slow down and spend some time. We got this double level street, would never have happened on a normal development. It was something that came out of the analysis of the heritage buildings, and it came out of our landscape guys actually having a look at the basement levels of all of these heritage buildings that would have been very difficult to use if we had kept them as basements. We might have got one sort of dark wine bar restaurant. If in Perth, you'd be really lucky to get two. There's no way you would have got five, but by cutting this second level or a lower level street there, that gave all of these buildings the opportunity to open out within an alfresco type environment that celebrates Perth climate, where you can sit outside for 70% of the year. Every single one of them got a tenant very, very quickly because of that. People have been thirsting for an indoor-outdoor experience in our cities. We live that way domestically, so why can't we do that in our cities? These heritage buildings let that happen. This is the old print hall, which I hope most of you have visited now. It's absolutely spectacular internally. it was on the verge of collapse. It's a single skin concrete wall, which you wouldn't build anymore. So as soon as you got it being warmer and moister outside than it was inside, it just sucked moisture through the walls. So all of the ceiling cornices you can see down the bottom here were collapsing. The interesting piece during construction here was these guys were using hot cutting equipment down here and lit a fire in here. So not only was it almost collapsing, we then had a fire, which I thought was a joke when the guys came back and told me. So about a third of this bar got burnt, but unfortunately the rest of it was saved and we were able to restore it. The issue that we had with working with this old heritage building is we needed to run services through the whole thing, and we needed to reskin the building to stop it leaking. So that's where we started. In conversations with the Heritage Council in the City of Perth, we connected a completely new wing onto the eastern end of it that was literally just a concrete box that we could run lifts and services on, and it meant we could leave all the rest of the building alone. And then we wrapped a new skin around the outside of the building, and that skin is deliberately contemporary and it's deliberately quite utilitarian. So we wanted it to be a reasonably plain, simple element because we wanted to celebrate the interiors of that building that are absolutely spectacular. This is the new build that we placed on at the upper level, and it means that people then approach underneath some cover, which is very helpful. And then we had some series of quite small insertions and demolitions that we did in conjunction with the advice we had from Palassus. It's important to bring a diverse range of skills to making these projects work, and landscape's critically important. It's a humanising experience to sit under a tree in the middle of a city next to the oldest school in the city. So this tree was actually brought in from up in the northwest where it had been pulled down from another development, and it helps connect the old buildings with the new spatial characteristics that we've got there. The heritage buildings provide a range of textures and an illustration of craft and a set of skills that don't exist in or are not widely used anymore. So in a commercial project, you don't get this sort of detailing around the windows, around the way the drain pipes are dealt with, the way the eaves are dealt with. So it's really fantastic to be able to counterpoint this with the new skins that are occurring in the new buildings. This is the print hall, which you can see this is the piece I was talking about that's been clipped on as a new element that allows you to experience the building the whole way around. And you can see this is the level of use that's not just when it first opened, it's still like this most Thursdays and most Fridays. So it's quite exciting to go in there and see the way the city has embraced these sorts of spaces. It's activated and it's different. So this again is some credit to Brookfield in terms of the arts program that they sponsor through there. So you can turn up and there's quite often something different happening here, and it's not always as overt as this occurring with the lighting schemes they put across the front, but there's usually something going on there each couple of weeks that's different to your experience when you were there a few weeks previously. People in general have a thirst for authenticity, and they can sniff something out that feels fake or contrived. So wherever there was intact heritage characteristics, they were properly restored in accordance with all the rules and regulations. But whenever we were doing something new, it was clearly new. So you can just see these skins are meant to just be very simple, clean commercial skins, because the delight is actually in these unusual, awkward little spaces down through here. Tell you a little story. Getting the juxtaposition right is really important, because without the financial firepower that this provides, and I love this building, I know lots of people don't, without the financial firepower that this provided to a development deal, none of those heritage buildings would have been relifed. We've had a range of people that go in and experience the ground level of this site, and they don't even notice that this is sitting up over the top. So for me, that's the sign of a successful development. I'm really pleased that you can see this from all over Perth because it marks the site, but I'm also equally pleased that this doesn't dominate your experience when you move through on the ground plane, because I think that's what we were setting out to achieve. That's it from me. I hope you've learnt something and you've enjoyed the experience. Thanks very much.